You don't need guns to break a neighborhood. You don't need violence, raids, or mass arrests. All you have to do is interrupt the flow of money. And in Harlem, that flow had a name: the numbers game. Small bets, daily payouts, cash moving hand to hand, block to block. To outsiders, it looked like illegal gambling. To the people who lived there, it was infrastructure. When authorities and rival interests decided to shut it down, they believed they had found the cleanest solution: starve the system, and the system collapses. Cut the payouts, and trust disappears. Break the rhythm of cash, and the man at the center, Bumpy Johnson, would be isolated without a single shot fired. On paper, it was a perfect strategy. No blood, no headlines, just pressure. What they failed to understand was what the numbers game actually represented. It wasn't just about winning or losing a bet. It paid rents when jobs didn't. It covered groceries when credit was unavailable. It provided a form of reliability in a city that often offered none. The system worked not because it was legal, but because it was consistent. And consistency, in an unstable environment, becomes authority. So when that system was threatened, the reaction wasn't fear, it was anger. Not directed upward at Bumpy Johnson, but outward toward the forces trying to choke the economy people depended on. This was the critical miscalculation. They assumed loyalty flowed from intimidation or profit. In Harlem, loyalty flowed from function. Bumpy didn't respond with force. He didn't escalate. He didn't declare war. He understood something his opponents didn't. When money is the battlefield, perception matters more than dominance. You don't win by hoarding resources. You win by keeping the system alive long enough for everyone to realize who's actually hurting them. This is not a story about crime or gambling. It's a story about economic warfare, about how cutting off cash can turn an entire city against you, and how power built on distribution can outlast pressure built on control. This is the moment when they tried to starve Harlem's numbers game. And Harlem decided who the real enemy was. To understand why cutting the numbers game was such a dangerous move, you first have to understand what it actually was. From the outside, it looked like a simple illegal lottery: small bets, daily drawings, quick payouts. But inside Harlem, the numbers game functioned as an economic circulatory system. It moved money faster than banks, reached people banks ignored, and operated on trust rather than paperwork. For thousands of residents, the numbers game wasn't about gambling addiction or easy money. It was microeconomics in its rawest form. A few cents placed in the morning could mean groceries by evening. Winnings were often reinvested immediately into rent, clothing, school supplies, or informal loans. The same dollar could change hands multiple times in a single day, creating liquidity in a neighborhood where formal credit barely existed. At the center of this system stood Bumpy Johnson, not as a casino owner, but as a guarantor. His real power wasn't collecting bets, it was ensuring payouts. When people won, they got paid. When someone fell short, arrangements were made. That reliability mattered more than legality. In an environment where institutions often failed to deliver, consistency became the highest form of authority. The numbers game also created employment. Runners, writers, collectors, entire informal job chains existed because of it. These weren't abstract roles. They were neighbors, relatives, people known by name. Shutting down the system didn't just remove an illegal activity. It pulled income out of households with no alternative waiting to replace it. This is where outsiders misjudged the situation. They saw revenue flowing upward and assumed greed was the glue holding the system together. In reality, the glue was distribution. Money flowed outward as much as it flowed up. When pressure mounted, people didn't ask whether the game was legal. They asked whether it still worked and whether someone was trying to break something that had kept the neighborhood afloat. In that context, attacking the numbers game wasn't an attack on crime. It was an attack on stability. And stability, once threatened, tends to produce alignment, not around ideology, not around loyalty to a person, but around survival. This is why the numbers game mattered. It wasn't a side operation. It was the economic backbone of Harlem's informal world. And anyone who tried to starve it wasn't just challenging Bumpy Johnson, they were challenging the daily life of an entire community. The plan wasn't dramatic. It didn't rely on raids or arrests, and it didn't aim for a headline. Instead, it targeted friction. If the numbers game could be made unreliable if payouts were delayed, if writers were pressured, if collection routes were disrupted, the system would collapse on its own. The logic was simple. People tolerate risk, but they abandon uncertainty. Pressure began at the edges. Small operators were leaned on first. Locations that recorded bets were forced to move constantly. Messengers were stopped and questioned, not arrested, just delayed long enough to interrupt timing. Banks weren't involved. Cash was. And cash depends on rhythm. Miss the rhythm, and confidence erodes. The strategy assumed that trust in the system was shallow. Break a few days of payouts, and participation would fall. Once participation fell, the structure would cannibalize itself. Writers would quit, runners would disappear. The remaining cash would dry up, and at the center, Bumpy Johnson would be left holding a hollow operation, blamed for a failure he could no longer fix. It was a clean theory, and it was wrong. What planners failed to grasp was that the numbers game wasn't sustained by excitement, it was sustained by expectation. People didn't play because they believed they would win big. They played because the system had proven, over time, that it would still be there tomorrow. Reliability had created habit, and habit had created loyalty. Disrupting that rhythm didn't turn people away from the system, it made them defensive of it. The pressure also misread scale. Shutting down a single writer didn't stop the flow, it rerouted it. Every interruption created alternatives. New paths formed, new intermediaries appeared. What looked like collapse from above looked like adaptation from below. The harder the squeeze became, the more inventive the responses grew. Most critically, the strategy treated the numbers game as a vertical structure where damage at the top would cascade downward. In reality, it was distributed. The base was wide, personal, and interconnected. When stress was applied, it spread horizontally through the community before it ever reached the center. By attempting to starve the system quietly, the attackers revealed themselves without ever naming a target. People didn't see a campaign against an illegal activity. They saw a campaign against their routines, their side incomes, their safety nets. And once that perception set in, the strategy began to backfire. Instead of isolating Bumpy Johnson, the effort reframed the conflict. It wasn't the state versus a gambler, it was outsiders versus Harlem's economy. And that distinction changed everything. Once the pressure campaign crossed a certain threshold, the conflict stopped being quiet. Not because of violence or confrontation, but because alignment became visible. This was the moment Bumpy Johnson shifted from defender of a system to architect of a counter-strategy. One that didn't escalate the fight but reversed its direction. Instead of pulling cash inward to protect himself, Bumpy pushed stability outward. Missed payouts were covered. Temporary gaps were bridged. People who depended on the numbers game were made whole, even when it cost more to do so. This wasn't generosity, it was strategy. By maintaining reliability under pressure, Bumpy sent a clear signal. The system still works. And in economic warfare, confidence is the most powerful currency. At the same time, something else happened organically. The neighborhood began to identify the source of disruption, not through announcements, but through pattern recognition. Delays happened after certain visits. Disruptions followed specific movements. Over time, the pressure campaign became legible. Once it was legible, it became avoidable. Participation didn't drop. It reorganized. People chose routes, intermediaries, and times that minimized interference. Writers who felt exposed stepped back, replaced by others with deeper local ties. Cash flows became more diffuse, harder to track, less vulnerable to targeted friction. The attempt to choke the system forced it to evolve. But the most significant shift wasn't logistical, it was social. The squeeze created resentment, and that resentment had a direction. Shops became less cooperative with outsiders. Conversations tightened. Information that once traveled freely began to stall selectively. This wasn't intimidation, it was preference. People decided who they would help and who they wouldn't. And once those preferences aligned, the pressure campaign lost its leverage. What made this reversal effective was that it required no coordination from the top. Bumpy didn't need to issue orders. The incentives spoke for him. Supporting the system meant stability. Undermining it meant isolation. Over time, the attackers found themselves working harder for diminishing returns, facing a city that had quietly chosen sides. This is how economic pressure backfires. When a system is deeply integrated into daily life, attacking it doesn't produce compliance, it produces solidarity. The numbers game didn't survive because it was protected. It survived because it was useful. And when usefulness is threatened, communities don't disperse, they consolidate. By trying to starve Harlem's economy, the campaign didn't weaken Bumpy Johnson. It transformed him into the focal point of resistance without him ever needing to say a word. By the end of the campaign, the lesson was unavoidable. Economics decides outcomes long before authority does. The attempt to starve Harlem's numbers game failed not because it lacked pressure, but because it targeted the wrong source of power. Money here was not merely profit, it was function. It paid bills, smoothed shocks, and created predictability where formal systems did not. When that function was threatened, the neighborhood responded rationally, not emotionally. This is where Bumpy Johnson proved something his opponents never fully grasped. Power is not measured by how much force you can apply, but by how many people depend on the system you maintain. Bumpy didn't need to intimidate anyone into loyalty. Dependence did that work for him. As long as daily life continued to operate through the numbers game, attacking it meant attacking the community itself. The failure also exposed a blind spot in top-down strategy. Economic pressure assumes that participants behave like isolated actors who will exit when costs rise. Harlem behaved like a network. Losses in one place were absorbed elsewhere. Shortfalls triggered support, not abandonment. Each attempt to squeeze value out of the system increased the number of people invested in keeping it alive. Pressure multiplied stakeholders. What ultimately collapsed was not the numbers game, but the credibility of the strategy used against it. The campaign promised quiet efficiency and produced visible disruption. It aimed to isolate one man and instead unified a city. In doing so, it demonstrated a fundamental rule of economic warfare. If your pressure harms too many people at once, you become the problem everyone wants to remove. This wasn't a victory declared with speeches or symbols. It was a reversion to equilibrium. Cash continued to circulate, trust stabilized, participation normalized. The city didn't celebrate, it simply resumed functioning, and that return to normalcy was the clearest signal of all. The system had held. In the end, the outcome had nothing to do with gambling or legality. It was about who could keep the lights on, metaphorically and literally. The side that could maintain distribution won without confrontation. The side that tried to choke distribution lost without understanding why. This is the reality of power when economics is the battlefield. Control the flow, and you control the city. Try to starve it, and the city will decide who it turns against. In the end, no one announced a defeat. There was no statement, no reversal, no acknowledgement that the strategy had failed. The pressure simply faded, not because it was countered with force, but because it had lost its leverage. The city kept moving, cash kept circulating. Life resumed its familiar rhythm, and that quiet return to normal was the clearest verdict of all. What this episode revealed is something far more durable than a single victory. It exposed how power actually works when economics becomes the battlefield. You can threaten people, intimidate them, even arrest them, but if you disrupt the system that keeps daily life functioning, you create enemies faster than compliance. Harlem did not rally around Bumpy Johnson out of fear or devotion. It aligned around continuity. Bumpy didn't win by overpowering anyone. He won by refusing to let the system fail, by absorbing short-term costs, by protecting reliability, and by keeping promises when pressure made that expensive. He demonstrated a form of authority that doesn't need enforcement. People didn't need to be told where to stand. The incentives made the decision for them. This is the blind spot of economic pressure campaigns everywhere. They assume scarcity will fracture communities. Sometimes it does. But when a system is deeply woven into everyday survival, scarcity can do the opposite. It can clarify who the threat really is. Once that clarity sets in, pressure loses its edge. It stops being a tool of control and becomes a catalyst for solidarity. The numbers game survived not because it was hidden, but because it was essential. And the attempt to starve it failed because it misunderstood that distinction. This wasn't about gambling, it was about distribution, about trust, about who could keep things working when it mattered most. So the lesson is simple, and it reaches far beyond Harlem. When money is the weapon, the winner isn't the one who can cut the deepest, it's the one who can keep the system alive. Control the flow, and you control the city. Try to choke it, and the city will decide who it turns against.